I built that company with my own 2 hands, my sister said, raising her glass high above the Thanksgiving table. And I couldn't have done it without all of you. The room filled with applause. My nephew smiled proudly. My niece wiped away a tear. Even some of the younger grandchildren looked at her with admiration. I sat perfectly still, my fork suspended halfway between my plate and my mouth. Because every word Linda had just spoken belonged to me. I'm Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that hard work would eventually speak for itself. That Thanksgiving taught me how wrong I was. The dining room glowed with warm light from the chandelier that had hung above my mother's table for nearly 40 years. The scent of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, and fresh dinner rolls filled the air. Outside, the November wind rattled the bare branches against the windows, but inside, everyone seemed comfortable, happy, and completely unaware of what was happening. Linda sat at the center of attention as she always did. At 71, my older sister had perfected the art of telling stories that made her look remarkable. She laughed easily, spoke confidently, and somehow always managed to become the most important person in any room she entered. I used to admire that about her. Later, I learned there was a difference between confidence and taking credit for things that never belonged to you. Remember when I started the business out of that tiny garage? She continued. More nods. More smiles. Back then, nobody believed it would survive. My chest tightened. The garage she described had been mine. The loan had carried my name. The risk had been mine. Every long night. Every missed vacation. Every payment I scraped together after my husband passed away. Mine. Yet nobody questioned her version of the story. Why would they? They had heard it for years. Small pieces at first. A detail changed here. A memory adjusted there. Little by little, the truth had been replaced by something more convenient. I glanced down the table toward my mother. Evelyn Collins was 89 years old now. Her silver hair framed a face that had seen nearly 9 decades of joy, heartbreak, sacrifice, and wisdom. Most people assumed she wasn't paying attention anymore. They were wrong. While everyone watched Linda, my mother watched the room. Her eyes moved from face to face. Quiet, careful, observing. When Linda finally sat down, another round of applause followed. I forced a polite smile. No one noticed how difficult it was. My mother did. Our eyes met for only a second. Something passed between us that I couldn't quite explain. A question, a warning, or maybe a promise. Then she slowly folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. It was such a small movement that nobody else seemed to notice. But I did, because I had seen that look before. And deep in my heart, I knew something was about to happen. I just didn't realize that before the night was over, a secret my mother had protected for more than 40 years would change everything my family thought they knew. As the conversation around the table continued, my thoughts drifted far from the Thanksgiving dinner unfolding in front of me. Watching Linda smile while everyone praised her brought back memories I had not revisited in years. There was a time when neither of us had much of anything. We grew up in a modest house on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. Our father worked long hours, and our mother stretched every dollar until it could stretch no more. Back then, success was not something anyone handed to you. You earned it one exhausting day at a time. After my husband, Robert, passed away unexpectedly at the age of 52, I found myself alone with bills, responsibilities, and a future that suddenly looked uncertain. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one rainy evening with a calculator, a stack of overdue notices, and a notebook filled with ideas. Most people would have seen problems. I saw possibilities. The business started in a detached garage behind my house. It was barely large enough to fit a pickup truck, let alone the furniture pieces I hoped to build and sell. During the summer, the heat inside felt unbearable. During the winter, I wore 2 sweaters and gloves while working because I could not afford better heating. There were nights when I stayed there until after midnight, measuring wood, answering customer calls, and completing orders that had to be delivered the next morning. I never complained. Every completed project meant another bill paid. Every satisfied customer meant another chance to keep moving forward. At first, almost nobody believed the business would survive. Banks rejected my loan applications more than once. A few relatives politely suggested that I should find a safer path. Even some friends questioned whether a woman in her 50s could build something from scratch after losing her husband. I listened. Then I returned to work. Slowly, things changed. One customer became 10. 10 became 50. Local newspapers began mentioning the company. Contractors started recommending us. By the time 5 years had passed, I had hired employees and moved operations into a proper facility. It was never glamorous. It was simply the result of persistence. Throughout those years, Linda was rarely involved. She had her own life, her own interests, and her own priorities. Occasionally, she attended family gatherings where people asked about my company. At first, she would simply stand nearby while I answered questions. Later, she began adding details to the stories. Harmless details, or so I thought at the time. If someone complimented the business, Linda would laugh and say, "We worked hard for that." The word "we" never seemed important enough to challenge. Then we slowly became I. I noticed it once during a family barbecue years ago. Linda was telling a neighbor about the company and speaking as though she had been there from the beginning. I remember feeling surprised, then embarrassed for even noticing. Family members exaggerate things sometimes, I told myself. It is not worth creating tension over. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment the story began changing. And every year after that, the version people remembered moved a little farther away from the truth. The older I became, the more I realized that people rarely rewrite history overnight. They do it gradually, one conversation at a time. As I sat at my mother's dining table that evening, I found myself remembering dozens of moments that had seemed insignificant when they happened. Now they felt different. Now they fit together. About 8 years earlier, the company had been featured in a regional business magazine. The reporter spent nearly 3 hours interviewing me inside our production facility. We walked through the workshop, discussed the challenges of building a business later in life, and talked about the employees who had become like family. When the article was published, I was proud of it. Not because of the attention, but because it reflected years of hard work. At a family gathering a few weeks later, one of my cousins congratulated Linda on the article. Before I could respond, she smiled and accepted the compliment. I remember waiting for her to correct the misunderstanding. She never did. Another time, one of my nephews asked how she had managed to grow the company during a difficult economic period. Instead of directing the question to me, Linda answered it herself. Everyone listened. I remember standing in the kitchen holding a tray of iced tea while she described decisions that I had actually made. The conversation moved on. Nobody noticed, including me. Or perhaps I noticed and chose silence because keeping peace seemed easier than creating conflict. Linda had always been good at positioning herself near success. She attended ribbon cuttings, anniversary celebrations, and charity events connected to the company. In photographs, she was often standing beside me. Years later, those photographs seemed to tell a different story. People remembered seeing her there. They assumed she had been involved. Assumptions slowly became facts. Facts slowly became family history. What troubled me most was not the recognition itself. I had never cared much about public praise. The company provided for my family, supported dozens of employees, and gave me purpose after losing Robert. That was enough. What hurt was watching the truth disappear while I stood quietly nearby. Across the table, Linda laughed at something one of the grandchildren said. Everyone laughed with her. She looked comfortable, confident, completely certain that the story belonged to her now. Then my eyes drifted toward my mother again. Evelyn had barely spoken all evening. She occasionally nodded or smiled, but mostly she listened. I suddenly remembered something she had told me years ago. We had been sorting old family photographs after my father passed away. She held up a picture and said, "The funny thing about memories is that people think they belong to whoever tells them the loudest." At the time, I thought it was simply one of her observations about life. Sitting there now, I wondered if she had been trying to teach me something. My mother slowly reached for her glass of water and took a small sip. Then she glanced toward the hallway that led to the staircase. It was a brief look, barely noticeable, yet something about it made my pulse quicken, because the old attic was upstairs, and somewhere in that attic sat boxes that had not been opened in decades. For a few minutes, the conversation returned to ordinary holiday topics. Someone asked about travel plans for Christmas. One of the grandchildren talked excitedly about college applications. Plates were passed around the table. Coffee was poured. To anyone walking into the room, it would have looked like a perfectly normal family gathering. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. I could feel it. My mother had always possessed a remarkable ability to remain patient. When I was young, I thought patience was simply part of her personality. As I grew older, I realized it was something much stronger. She watched. She listened. She remembered. While other people rushed to conclusions, Evelyn Collins collected facts. That habit had served her well for nearly 90 years. Linda continued enjoying the attention. The more compliments she received, the more animated she became. Soon she was sharing stories about difficult business decisions, major contracts, and company milestones. Listening to her was like hearing someone describe a life they had borrowed from another person. What surprised me most was how detailed some of her stories had become. Over the years, she had repeated them so often that she seemed to believe them herself. Memory can be a strange thing. Sometimes people tell a story so many times that they stop recognizing the difference between truth and performance. I looked around the table at my nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. None of them had been there during those difficult early years. They had never seen the tiny garage. They had never seen me balancing invoices at midnight or loading furniture into a truck before sunrise. They only knew the successful company that existed today. Their understanding of the past came entirely from the stories they had been told. Suddenly, my mother set down her coffee cup. The small sound of porcelain touching would seem louder than it should have. Conversation slowed. Not because anyone expected something important to happen, but because Evelyn rarely interrupted anything. She cleared her throat gently. "Daniel," she said, looking at my oldest nephew, "would you do me a favor?" Daniel immediately nodded. "Of course, Grandma. There is a blue storage box in the attic. It should be near the back wall beside the old cedar chest. Would you bring it down for me?" The request seemed harmless enough. A few family members exchanged curious looks. Linda laughed softly. "Mom, what on earth do you need from the attic on Thanksgiving?" My mother smiled. "Something I have been meaning to look at for a very long time." Daniel pushed back his chair and headed toward the staircase. I felt my stomach tighten. A blue storage box. I knew exactly which one she meant. I had not thought about it in years. Inside were pieces of family history that nobody talked about anymore. Old documents, photographs, letters, records from decades earlier. Items most people would consider unimportant. Yet my mother had kept them all. Linda seemed unconcerned. She reached for another dinner roll and continued chatting with the family. But I noticed something then. For the first time all evening, my mother was not watching the room. She was watching Linda. And there was a calm certainty in her eyes that I had never seen before. Whatever sat inside that blue box, she already knew exactly what it would prove. The room grew quieter as we waited for Daniel to return. Nobody said it out loud, but curiosity had settled over the table like a blanket. Even the younger grandchildren seemed unusually attentive. From upstairs came the faint sound of footsteps crossing the old attic floor. Then silence. Then more footsteps. I could picture the space perfectly. Dusty rafters, stacked boxes, forgotten holiday decorations. Decades of family history tucked away where nobody thought to look anymore. Linda remained relaxed, although I noticed she had stopped telling stories. Instead, she focused on her coffee cup, tracing one finger along the rim while listening to the conversations around her. My mother sat calmly beside me. Her expression revealed nothing. That was another thing Evelyn had mastered over the years. She never showed her hand before she was ready. Several minutes later, Daniel appeared at the top of the staircase carrying a medium-sized blue storage box. It looked older than I remembered. The corners were worn. A strip of faded masking tape stretched across one side. As he carefully brought it into the dining room, nearly every conversation stopped. "This one?" he asked. My mother nodded. "Yes. Set it right here beside me." Daniel placed the box on the floor near her chair. Linda laughed lightly. "Mom, now you have everyone wondering what treasure is hidden in there." A few people smiled. My mother smiled too. "Perhaps it is treasure." Her answer sounded simple enough, yet something about the way she said it made the room fall quiet again. Slowly, she removed the lid. A faint scent of old paper drifted into the air. Inside were dozens of folders, envelopes, photographs, and notebooks organized with remarkable care. My mother had always kept records of everything. Birth certificates, school awards, family letters, documents most people would have thrown away years ago. She reached into the box and lifted out a thick photo album. The cover showed signs of age, but it remained in excellent condition. "I have not looked through this in a long time," she said. My nephew leaned forward. "What is it?" "A family record," she replied. "The kind people forget exists until they need it." She opened the album slowly. The first pages contained photographs from decades earlier. Birthday parties, graduations, summer picnics, family vacations. Everyone smiled as old memories resurfaced. Laughter returned to the table. Tension eased. For a moment, it seemed as though perhaps the box contained nothing important at all. Then my mother turned several pages and stopped. Her eyes remained fixed on a particular photograph. I recognized it instantly. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture taken inside the original garage workshop during the first year of the business. Sawhorses stood against one wall. Lumber was stacked neatly in the corner. A handwritten business plan rested on a folding table. And standing directly in the center was me. Not Linda. Me. My mother quietly removed the photograph from its sleeve and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. For the first time all evening, Linda's smile disappeared. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The photograph rested in the center of the table beneath the warm dining room lights. It was impossible to misunderstand what everyone was seeing. There I stood inside that cramped garage workshop, wearing an old denim shirt covered with sawdust, holding a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. Behind me sat the first workbench I had ever purchased for the business. The date printed in the corner showed it had been taken nearly 20 years earlier. My nephew leaned closer. "That is you, Aunt Margaret." It was not a question. It was a realization. My mother nodded gently. "Yes, it is." Linda forced a small smile. "Well, of course Margaret was involved. We all helped in different ways back then." The explanation sounded reasonable at first. A few people nodded uncertainly, but my mother was already reaching back into the box. She removed another photograph. Then another. Then another. One showed me unloading lumber from a delivery truck. Another showed me standing beside the first company sign. A third captured me shaking hands with the very first commercial client. Every image told the same story. The same person appeared again and again. Me. Not Linda. The room grew noticeably quieter. My niece picked up one of the photographs and studied it carefully. "I do not remember ever seeing these." "Most people have not," my mother replied. "I kept them because I believed they mattered." Then she opened a large manila envelope. Inside were neatly organized documents protected by clear plastic sleeves. She handed the first page to Daniel. His eyes moved across the paper. His expression changed almost immediately. "This is the original business registration." He looked up. "The owner listed here is Margaret Collins." Another document followed. Then another. The first loan application. The lease agreement for the production facility. Early tax records. Every signature belonged to me. Every official document carried my name. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief. Sadness. Validation. Not because I needed proof for myself. I had lived the truth every day. But for years I had watched that truth slowly fade in the minds of the people I loved. Across the table, Linda folded her hands together. She no longer looked comfortable. She no longer looked confident. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain about what would happen next. My mother remained calm. "There is more," she said quietly. She reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out a worn spiral notebook. I recognized it instantly. My heart skipped. It was the original business journal I had kept during those difficult early years. Every expense, every sale, every goal, every setback. I had written everything down. I thought I had lost it long ago. "Mom," I whispered, "you still have that." She smiled softly. "I kept it because one day I thought someone might need to remember how things really happened." Then she carefully opened the notebook to the first page, and what she revealed next changed the entire atmosphere in the room. My mother carefully turned the brittle pages of the notebook while every eye at the table followed her movements. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. Page after page documented the earliest days of the company. Dates, customer names, supply costs, delivery schedules, small victories that had felt enormous at the time. My mother stopped at an entry written nearly 19 years earlier and handed the notebook to Daniel. He read aloud. "Worked 14 hours today. Finished the Henderson order. Paid the electric bill with the final check. If business stays steady for 3 more months, I might be able to hire my first employee." The room remained silent. He flipped to another page. "Met with the bank this morning. Loan approved. Finally." I cried in the parking lot afterward because I was so relieved. My niece looked from the notebook to me. "You wrote all of this?" I nodded. Every page. Another notebook entry described purchasing equipment. Another detailed negotiations with a supplier. Every challenge. Every decision. Every milestone. There was no confusion about who had lived those moments. The evidence was sitting in plain sight. Linda shifted in her chair. Well, Margaret always liked keeping journals, she said with a nervous laugh. That does not mean I was not helping behind the scenes. Nobody responded immediately. The certainty that had filled the room earlier was beginning to fade. Questions were replacing assumptions. My mother quietly reached into the box once more and removed a stack of folded letters tied together with a ribbon. I recognized them immediately. They were letters I had written to her during those difficult years when I was trying to keep the business alive. Before text messages, before video calls, back when writing things down felt easier than saying them aloud. She untied the ribbon and selected one letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Listen to this, she said. Then she began reading. The words transported me back in time. I had written about struggling to balance grief after Robert's passing with the demands of building a future. I described working weekends, worrying about payroll, and hoping the company would survive another year. I thanked my mother for encouraging me when I wanted to quit. There was no mention of Linda running the business. No mention of shared leadership. The story recorded in those letters matched the story preserved in the documents, the photographs, and the journal. They all pointed to the same truth. Around the table, family members exchanged glances. Some looked surprised. Others looked thoughtful. A few seemed embarrassed. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because they were realizing how easily they had accepted a version of events without ever questioning it. Linda stared down at the tablecloth. For the first time all evening, she seemed to have no story ready. No polished explanation. No charming anecdote. Just silence. Then my mother folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the notebook. She looked around the room before speaking again. What I have shown you tonight is only the beginning, she said softly. Because there is one thing none of you know about how this company truly started. My mother's words settled over the room with a weight that nobody could ignore. Even the youngest family members seemed to sense that something important was about to be revealed. She folded her hands on top of the old notebook and looked directly at me. There was kindness in her eyes, but there was something else too. Determination. The kind that only comes from carrying a truth for many years. Most of you know that Margaret started the company after Robert passed away, she began. Several heads nodded. What you do not know is how close she came to losing everything before it ever had a chance to succeed. I lowered my eyes for a moment. There were parts of those years I rarely discussed. Not because I was ashamed, but because they belonged to a chapter of my life that had been painful and deeply personal. My mother reached into the box again and removed a small envelope. Unlike the other documents, this one looked especially worn. She carefully opened it and slid a cashier's check receipt onto the table. Daniel picked it up first. What is this? He asked. The payment that saved the company, my mother replied. Several family members leaned forward. Linda remained completely still. 19 years ago, my mother continued, Margaret was days away from losing the workshop. A supplier demanded payment. The bank would not extend additional credit. She never told most of you because she did not want anyone to worry. I remembered that week clearly. I had barely slept. Every phone call felt like bad news waiting to happen. Every bill seemed larger than the one before. What happened? One of my grandnieces asked softly. My mother smiled gently. Margaret found a way through it. Just like she always did. She pointed to the receipt. That payment came from the sale of a small piece of land Robert and Margaret had planned to keep for retirement. The room fell silent again. I had forgotten that my mother even knew about that decision. Back then, I sold the property without hesitation because protecting the company meant protecting the future. The employees depended on it. The customers depended on it. My family depended on it. My mother continued. She gave up something valuable so that everyone else could keep moving forward. She never asked for praise. She never told the story. She simply went back to work the next morning. I noticed tears forming in my niece's eyes. Daniel slowly set the receipt back on the table. I never knew any of this, he said. That is because she never wanted credit, my mother answered. Then she turned toward Linda. Not with anger. Not with accusation. Just with quiet honesty. But there is a difference between not seeking credit and allowing someone else to rewrite history. No one spoke. Linda looked down at her folded hands. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes. My mother gently closed the notebook. The truth has a way of waiting patiently, she said. And eventually, it finds its voice. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound came from the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint rattle of wind against the windows outside. The Thanksgiving dinner that had started with celebration now felt completely different. Not because anyone had shouted or argued. Quite the opposite. The truth had entered the room quietly, and it had changed everything. I looked around the table at the faces of the people I loved. Some appeared thoughtful. Some looked surprised. A few seemed regretful. Daniel was still holding one of the old photographs. My niece sat with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, staring at the documents spread across the table. It was as though they were all seeing the same family history for the first time. Finally, Linda lifted her eyes. She looked older somehow. Not because of the years, but because the confidence she had worn all evening was gone. "Margaret," she said softly. My name hung in the air between us. I never meant for it to go this far. I studied her face. For years, I had imagined what I might say if this moment ever came. I thought I would feel angry. I thought I would want an apology. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Because the truth no longer needed defending. It was sitting right there on the table for everyone to see. "I know," I replied. And strangely, I did know. Somewhere along the way, small exaggerations had become larger stories. Larger stories had become accepted memories. And accepted memories had slowly replaced reality. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. Her grip was gentle but steady. "People remember what they hear most often," she said. "But that does not make it true." Several family members nodded. Then Daniel stood and raised his coffee cup. "I think we should give credit where it belongs," he said. He looked directly at me. "To Aunt Margaret. For building something extraordinary. And for never asking for recognition while doing it." One by one, everyone lifted their glasses. The gesture was simple. No grand speeches. No dramatic moment. Just honesty. The kind that had been missing for far too long. I glanced at my mother. She smiled and leaned back in her chair, looking completely at peace. The blue storage box remained open beside her, its contents spread across the table like pieces of a forgotten map that had finally led everyone home. Later that evening, after dessert had been served and conversations returned to normal, I helped my mother place everything back into the box. The photographs, the letters, the journal, the documents. Before closing the lid, I paused and looked at them one last time. For years, I believed success was the greatest thing I had built. That night, I realized I was wrong. Success can fade. Businesses can change. Buildings can be sold. But truth endures. As I carried the box toward the hallway, my mother called after me. "Do not leave that in the attic again." I smiled. "I will not." And, for the first time in many years, I knew none of us would forget what really happened.